The United States has conducted airstrikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities.
For the second consecutive year, Montreal's annual Canada Day parade has been cancelled.
Critics are blasting Prime Minister Mark Carney over how he's handling the US's imposition of 50% tariffs on Canadian steel. Hello Canada, it's Monday, June 23rd, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Noah Jarvis.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. The United States conducted airstrikes on Iran, targeting 3 nuclear sites within the country, marking the first direct American strike since the Israel-Iran conflict broke out last week. President Donald Trump announced the attacks on Truth Social before addressing the nation in a short televised announcement. The sites were known to be facilities where the Iranian regime was enriching uranium. Trump spoke at 10 p.m. Eastern Time from the White House discussing the military operation in Iran. He characterized the moment as a, quote, historic moment for the United States of America, Israel, and the world, and demanded that Iran must now agree to end this war. Iran's leadership had previously warned the United States on Wednesday that strikes targeting the regime would, quote, result in irreparable damage for them. Ismail Baghei, a spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, noted that, quote, any American intervention would be a recipe for an all-out war in the region. The Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen, who reached a deal with the United States in May, have indicated they would resume attacks on U.S. vessels in the Red Sea if the U.S. joined Israel's military campaign. This is obviously the most significant news to come out of the presidency of Donald Trump, and in terms of how it affects Canada, it might be the most significant next to the actual trade tariffs that are still ongoing. How has Prime Minister Mark Carney responded to this? I mean, this is a huge escalation in international affairs, but it's also something that will have wide-reaching geopolitical effects, not only on Canada, but foreign policy abroad. So what has the response been from the Canadian government, but also Prime Minister Mark Carney himself?
Well, there has been no endorsement of these strikes thus far when Israel began striking key facilities, especially nuclear facilities in Iran. Prime Minister Carney and the Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand did not endorse the strikes. However, they did say and reiterate that it is of the Canadian government's view that Iran should not possess any nuclear weapons and that they ought to cease enriching uranium to the level that they are currently, and they have also called for de-escalation and a return to negotiations and talks. However, these negotiations have been going on for over a decade. If you recall, in 2015, President Obama signed an agreement with Iran that was then subsequently ripped up by President Trump in his first term. And since then, the Biden administration, they attempted to negotiate with Iran unsuccessfully, and now that Trump is back in office, Iran has continued to enrich uranium to very high levels. They are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles. I believe they have already successfully developed those missiles, and a nuclear warhead could be outfitted on top of those missiles. So Iran is getting dangerously close to obtaining a nuclear weapon, and it seems as if Prime Minister Carney and his government recognizes that the severity of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon have come out clearly against this being a possibility. And while they have not condemned the military action against Iran's 3 nuclear facilities, they did not explicitly endorse it. This was a similar statement that Keir Starmer had also put out. With that being said, conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, he had been a bit more supportive of the the strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. Pierre Poilievre made it very clear that the regime in Iran is a genocidal regime, and that the, quote, American and Israeli actions to stop it from getting one being a nuclear bomb, are 100% justified. So Pierre Poilievre is just coming out and endorsing the strikes against these nuclear facilities. I think that many people in the West are thankful that the United States and Israel had the backbone, had the will to strike those facilities. I know that the German chancellor said something similar to that effect. But if Canada is not going to be supportive of these strikes, it really begs the question, what sort of military action can the Carney government support? I mean, they're not supporting Israel's war against Hamas. They are not coming out and, giving a strong statement of support for the Israel and the United States striking these nuclear facilities. So it really begs the question what they are going to support. This is a strike that is clearly in the best interest of the Western world. Iran, some of their mottos include death to Israel and death to America. And if they're chanting death to America, I mean, we're neighbors with the United States. A vast majority of Canada's population lives very close to the American border. So if Iran, God forbid, they ever did attempt to strike the United States with nuclear weapons, Canada would also be on the chopping block. So I think it's a very good thing that Israel and the United States have conducted these strikes to ensure that Iran does not obtain these weapons. Although I believe that a lot of Canadians would have liked to seen Prime Minister Carney give a stronger statement in support to that effect. For the second consecutive year, Montreal's annual Canada Day parade has been cancelled, with organizers citing ongoing labor disruptions and strained relations with the city government. Nicholas Cohen, the longtime organizer of the parade, announced the cancellation in a media release Wednesday, calling it a difficult situation caused by persistent planning disruptions. Cohen said, quote, "Safety is our number one priority when it comes to large events such as the Montreal Canada Day Parade. When different city departments of workers cause disruptions, you no longer just have to focus on the safety of the public, but the functional aspect of the event." Cohen pointed to deteriorating condition with the city government as a challenge, saying relations with city officials have worsened in recent years after the COVID-19 pandemic. He accused the city of failing to provide meaningful solutions despite assurances from the mayor's office that his concerns would be addressed. First held in 1977, the Canada Day Parade has traditionally drawn thousands of spectators to downtown Montreal each year. The event's future has since become uncertain, with Cohen canceling last year's edition as well, citing excessive bureaucratic red tape. At the time, the city said no permit requests had been submitted. City officials issued a similar response this week, stating that Cohen again failed to submit a project application for this year's parade, despite repeated invitations from municipal staff. Meanwhile, the city confirmed that a different Canada Day celebration, La Marche en Marche, organized by Production EGP, will proceed on July 1st. In addition, the City of Montreal will host its official Canada Day event at the Quai de l'Horloge in the Old Port. Cohen acknowledged the impact of rising costs and labor negotiations on city workers, saying he understands their grievances, but emphasized that the lack of cooperation makes it nearly impossible to stage a public event of this size. So, Cosmin, it's really ironic that Montreal, one of the biggest supporters of the Liberal Party in the last election, the Elbows Up Liberal Party, is having a hard time organizing a simple Canada Day event. A Canada Day event that has been going on for decades now, since 1977. And this is an event that you would think would draw a bunch of Canada-loving, patriotic Canadians who are opposed to Canada becoming the 51st state. Yet there's not enough enthusiasm for actually getting this Canada Day celebration up and going. So why aren't the Elbows Up Liberals enthusiastic about celebrating Canada Day?
Well, it does seem to be a repeat of 2024. If you recall back then, the same issue reared its head. But you're absolutely right. There is a different climate, or rather context, to this year's celebration because of all of the showboating, you might add, that the Liberals, and Montreal being a heavily Liberal voting region, did during the last federal election. But I would blame this on local municipal government, and we know that Mayor Valérie Plante is on her way out. She's actually not seeking a third term, and her term is going to finish up this year in November, and she won't be running up for re-election, so Montreal is set to get a new mayor at least. But she's also not very popular. Most of the polls suggest that she's down, and a majority of Montrealers do not want to see 4 more years of her being in the head office for municipal affairs. But it makes you question. There are smaller towns, smaller cities than Montreal that are perfectly fine with having a Canada Day parade. There's no issues to do that, but for somehow Montreal, this one of Canada's largest and most successful metropolitan areas, simply can't get it together. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government is facing strong criticism from political opposition and industry groups over its handling of the United States' decision to impose a 50% tariff on Canadian steel. On Thursday, Carney announced that the government would be imposing new tariff measures to counteract the elevated tariff rate U.S. President Donald Trump imposed on Canadian steel imports. In March, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian steel, to which the Canadian government almost immediately responded with its own 25% tariff. However, industry groups are disappointed with the government's response to Trump's new tariff hike. In a joint statement issued on Thursday, the Canadian Steel Producers Association and the United Steelworkers Union slammed the Carney government for their retaliatory measures against the American tariffs. The Carney government imposed a new tariff rate quota on steel products at 100% of 2024 levels, applied retroactively to steel imports for the entire year. The government also announced that it would be adopting additional tariff measures in the coming weeks to protect Canada's steel and aluminum sectors on the basis of country of melt and pour for steel and country of smelt and cast for aluminum. The Conservative Party joined the chorus in slamming the Liberal government for its failure in responding to Trump's tariff hike on Canadian steel, claiming the Prime Minister dragged his feet. In a joint statement between Conservative MPs Raquel Dancho, Shelby Cramp-Newman, and Adam Chambers, they said that under Carney's leadership, tariffs on Canadian steel have only gotten worse, devastating Canadian businesses. The MPs said, quote, "Despite the Prime Minister having had months to act, he has dragged his feet. Now Canadian steel is facing an existential threat, and the plan he announced falls short," according to steel industry and steel workers. Their futures are uncertain as thousands of jobs and billions in economic activity are at risk because this government, which ran on standing up to President Trump, has failed in its foremost objective. The MPs added that losing Canada's steel industry not only means the loss of thousands of jobs and economic harm, but is also a threat to Canada's national security. There doesn't seem to be consistency from the Carney government when it comes to its position on retaliation. If you recall back, they initially went into retaliatory dollar-for-dollar tariffs. That was the original pitch to Canadians during the election. But then we've discovered, because of Oxford Economics, that the Carney government actually exempted a vast majority of the goods under its own retaliatory tariffs. During the election, at least the decision was made by cabinet while Prime Minister Mark Carney was campaigning. And it was pretty much hidden up. And then now they increased these quotas for a 30-day period until presumably a trade deal gets signed with the United States. But why hasn't Carney been decisive in his approach to combating American tariffs?
I think it's unclear as to the direct reasoning as to why Prime Minister Carney and his government has been so wishy-washy on tariffs, but I think it's pretty concerning that the Prime Minister in his first few months in the role feels so comfortable saying one thing to the Canadian public and taking a completely different approach when it comes to actually implementing policy. We saw on the campaign trail Montreal, as you mentioned, that the Liberals, they campaigned on dollar-for-dollar tariffs. That was the entire objective, to ensure that the United States, they don't annex us or something like that, or at the very least, they don't commit severe economic harm against workers in, say, the steel industry or the aluminum industry. However, as you mentioned, the exemptions really shows that the Canadian government, the Carney government, is not actually serious in implementing these dollar-for-dollar tariffs. Now, quite frankly, I don't think that retaliatory tariffs is necessarily a good idea. You're still committing economic harm against yourself when you impose tariffs in that manner. But at the end of the day, this was the approach that Prime Minister Carney campaigned on. It is the one that his government got a mandate for, and he is not taking that approach whatsoever. It is really concerning that he would go to a steel plant, or he would just tell people in the automotive sector, in the steel sector, in the aluminum sector, that their jobs will be protected by the Canadian government in the imposition of tariffs against the United States. But he would say those nice platitudes to those workers, and then turn around and take his time, drag his feet in conducting a response to the increase of tariffs on Canadian steel from 25% to 50%. It also seems as if the Carney government isn't really making any progress in getting President Trump to back down on his tariffs. In fact, all Prime Minister Carney has managed to do is get a photo op with the president in Kananaskis and at the White House, whereas President Trump has continued to increase tariffs. As we already mentioned, on June 3rd, he increased tariffs on on Canadian steel to 50%. So it doesn't seem as if he is making progress on those key objectives. And how long will the Canadian public wait to give the Prime Minister in order to tangibly see results? Prime Minister Carney and President Trump, they committed to getting a trade deal done within a month after the conclusion of the G7. So I think that we'll, in due time, be seeing the fruits of the Canadian government's labor. But if an agreement is shown to the Canadian public that still has massively high tariffs on Canadian goods going into the United States, and the Americans are able to carve out exemptions favorable to them in a new trade agreement, I think the Canadian public, they're going to start to turn on Prime Minister Carney. Instead of viewing him as a competent technocratic elite, they're going to view him as an incompetent, arrogant person who lied to the Canadian public in an election campaign.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating, and please leave a review.